The wind had a voice in this high, lonely country, and it spoke only of endings. It scoured the plains, stripping the last stubborn leaves from the aspen and rattling the frame of the half-built cabin that was to have been Alara's home. Now, it was little more than a skeletal monument to a dead man's promise. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine and the coming snow, a clean, cold fragrance that felt like a blade against her throat. Each gust that tore through the unchinked gaps in the log walls was a fresh reminder of her failure, of the creeping, inevitable frost that would soon claim everything. Her husband, Daniel, had seen grit in her. He'd said it himself, his hand warm on her back as they looked out over this vast, unforgiving expanse of Wyoming territory. You have the constitution for this land, Alara, but his constitution had failed him first, a fever burning through him with the speed and fury of a prairie fire, leaving her with nothing but his tools, a dwindling sack of flour, and the crushing weight of the sky. The silence he left behind was heavier than any stone. Inside the cabin, the light was failing. She sat on a rough-hewn stool, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm chicory water. They were chapped and raw, the nails broken, the skin etched with the memory of axes she could barely lift and saws that fought her with every pull. She had tried. Gods, she had tried. But the roof was only half finished, a patchwork of hope and futility against the deepening gray overhead. The cold was a physical presence now, seeping up from the packed earth floor and sinking into her bones. It was a cold that promised a slow, quiet death, an anonymous surrender to the wilderness. Her gaze drifted to the window, a simple square cut from the logs, empty of glass. Beyond the skeletal trees that clawed at the horizon, she could see the distant curl of smoke from another chimney. His chimney, the man who lived on the far ridge, the one the few souls at the distant trading post called Silas. They spoke of him in low, cautionary tones. A man who kept to himself, who had come from somewhere back east shadowed by rumors of violence. He moved with a predator's economy, silent and watchful. She had seen him sometimes, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette moving through the timberline, an axe resting on his shoulder with an unnerving ease. He never looked her way, but she felt his awareness, a prickling on her skin like the static before a lightning strike. To her, he was just another part of the landscape's inherent threat, a man as hard and unyielding as the granite jutting from the hillsides. A sharp rap on her door, carried on a sudden blast of wind, made her spill the bitter water. It wasn't him. This was a different kind of predator. Mr. Barlow, from the settlement, filled the doorway, his bulk blocking what little light remained. He removed his hat, revealing a pate slick with sweat despite the cold, his smile a greasy smear in his fleshy face. "Evening, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice oozing a counterfeit sympathy that did nothing to warm the air. "Just checking on the widow." A woman alone, winter coming on fast. His eyes roamed the sparse, unfinished interior, assessing her weakness, cataloging her despair. They lingered on the meager pile of firewood, the threadbare blanket on her cot, and then on her. "This is no place for you. A delicate woman needs a man's protection. I could take this claim off your hands, give you a fair price, enough to get you back to wherever you came from." The offer was an insult wrapped in pity. He wanted the land, the water rights Daniel had painstakingly secured. He saw not a grieving woman, but an obstacle to be removed. She felt a tremor of rage, hot and useless, under the thick blanket of her fear. "I am not leaving," she managed, her voice a thin, reedy thing. Barlow's smile tightened. "Stubbornness won't keep you warm, little lady. Think on it. When that first real snow flies, my offer might be the only thing between you and a frozen grave." He placed his hat back on his head and was gone, leaving the scent of bay rum and avarice hanging in the air. Alara stared at the empty doorway, the wind howling through it, and for the first time, the thought of that frozen grave felt less like a threat and more like a quiet, inevitable peace. The fight was leaving her. Daniel had been wrong. There was no grit left, only the fine, cold dust of what used to be. The next morning, she awoke to a world encased in frost. A profound, aching stillness had fallen, the kind that precedes the first heavy snow. When she pushed open the heavy plank door, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Stacked neatly against the outer wall, reaching halfway to the roofline, was a cord of firewood. Split pine and oak, perfectly cut, seasoned, and ready for the hearth. It was a wall of warmth, a bastion against the coming winter, a miracle she could not comprehend. There were no tracks in the hard, frozen ground save for her own. It was as if the wood had simply appeared, a silent offering from the uncaring land itself. She spent the day in a haze of confusion, her eyes constantly scanning the timberline, the distant ridge where Silas's cabin stood. She saw no one, yet she knew. The sheer physical labor of it, the quiet efficiency, spoke of a strength she had only ever witnessed from that distance. He had done this, but why? Pity was a currency she had come to despise, and charity from a stranger felt like a debt she could never repay. She felt watched, not with menace, but with a dispassionate, unnerving scrutiny. Days turned into a week. The silent gifts continued. A brace of rabbits, dressed and cleaned, left hanging from a nail by her door. A patch on the half-finished roof, secured with new timbers she hadn't cut. A snare line she'd abandoned as a failure, now reset and productive. He never showed himself, never made a sound. He was a ghost, a protector she had not asked for. His motives as shrouded as the peaks in the morning mist. The fear she'd held for him began to curdle into something else. A wary, complicated gratitude that chafed against her pride. She refused to be a helpless creature, a charity case for a silent mountain man. So she began to work. Fueled by his unspoken challenge, she found a strength she thought had died with Daniel. She used the wood he provided to keep a constant, roaring fire, its heat giving her the energy to swing the heavy maul, splitting her own logs from a fallen pine. Her hands bled, then calloused over. The muscles in her back and shoulders burned, then hardened into taut cords. She learned the rhythm of the work, the marriage of breath and force. She started chinking the walls herself, mixing mud and grass with numb fingers, pressing it into the gaps with a fierce, desperate determination. The wind still whistled through, but its voice was softer now, less a threat and more a mournful song. She began to leave things for him in return. It was a silent, delicate negotiation. A small loaf of cornbread, wrapped in a clean cloth and left on a stump that marked the edge of her property. It would be gone by morning. She mended a leather glove she found near her woodpile, its palm worn through, and left it in the same spot. Too vanished. They communicated through these objects, these small acts of labor and provision. It was a language without words, built on the stark necessities of survival. He gave her the means to endure. She gave him the small comforts of a life she was clawing back from the edge. She was no longer just the widow on the losing claim. She was a presence, a force of will pushing back against the encroaching wilderness. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that the man on the ridge was watching her transformation. The sky had been a sheet of bruised pewter for 2 days, the air thick with a heavy, expectant silence. Then the blizzard came. It did not arrive so much as it materialized, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world. The wind screamed, a physical assault that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Elara had spent the day securing what she could, banking the fire high with Silas's wood, the flames a roaring defiance against the storm's fury. The chinking she had so painstakingly applied held, but fine, crystalline dustings of snow still found their way through the tiniest cracks, coating every surface in a delicate rime. The world shrank to the 4 walls of her small shelter. Hours bled together, marked only by the feeding of the fire and the relentless, deafening howl of the wind. It was in the deepest dark of the first night that a thudding against the door, distinct from the storm's chaos, sent a bolt of pure ice through her veins. Could only be one person, Barlow. He would see the storm as his opportunity, her isolation as his invitation. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight a pathetic reassurance, and stared at the rattling door. But when the latch lifted and the door blew inward on a tidal wave of snow, The figure that filled the space was not Barlow. It was Silas. He was a colossus of winter, his shoulders and hat laden with snow, his beard glinting with ice crystals. He shoved the door closed against the gale, the sound of the storm instantly muffled to a distant roar. He didn't speak. He simply unwound the scarf from his face and shook the snow from his heavy coat, his presence seeming to consume all the air in the small room. He carried a burlap sack, from which he produced a slab of salted pork and a small tin of coffee. He placed them on her small table without ceremony. His gaze swept the cabin, noting the neatly stacked wood, the secured roof patches, the determined order she had wrested from the chaos. It was a look of appraisal, not judgment. He moved to the fire, taking the poker from her unresisting hand and expertly tending the logs, his movements economical and precise. The oppressive tension in the room was thick enough to taste. He was a stranger, a dangerous man by reputation, and now he was sealed inside her home with her, a captive of the very storm he seemed a part of. They existed in that space for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. She made coffee, her hands shaking as she handed him a cup. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers, a touch that sent a jolt, not of fear, but of a startling, unexpected warmth through her. He drank it, his eyes fixed on the flames. The silence stretched, becoming its own form of communication. It was not empty, but filled with the weight of unspoken things, of shared hardship and the brute reality of their survival. The storm raged on, a relentless siege. Exhaustion began to wear away at her resolve, her fear resurfacing in the face of this overwhelming, masculine presence. He was so large, so capable. His quietude felt like a coiled power. All her life, men's protection had come with a price, their desires a constant, menacing undercurrent. Barlow's leering face swam in her memory. In her weary, frayed mind, Silas's silent assistance began to twist into something transactional. He had kept her alive. He had provided for her. What would he expect in return? The cabin, the fire, the forced intimacy. It all felt like a trap closing around her. She looked at him, at the breadth of his shoulders, the sheer, undeniable physicality of him in the flickering firelight. A wave of despair washed over her, the bitter taste of a reality she had always known. She was a woman alone. Her body was her only remaining currency. The thought was a vile poison, but it was a truth the world had taught her again and again. In a voice so low it was nearly lost to the fire, a whisper of pure, broken surrender, she spoke the words. "You want me for my body." It was not a question. It was a statement of exhausted defeat. Silas stopped his methodical cleaning of a knife, his hands going still. He turned his head slowly, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, meeting hers. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, making his expression unreadable. There was no flicker of lust, no hint of agreement. There was only a profound, bottomless stillness. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her, and in that gaze, she felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and utterly new. It was a look that bypassed her fear, her exhaustion, her physical form, and seemed to touch the very core of the woman she was trying to become. He did not reply. He did not need to. He simply turned back to his task, his movements deliberate. He placed another log on the fire, the solid thud echoing in the sudden quiet of her heart. Then he moved his bedroll not closer to her cot, but to the place beside the door, positioning himself as a guard, a silent sentinel between her and the raging storm outside. In the quiet dark of the cabin, as the blizzard howled its impotent fury, the unspoken vow settled in the space between them, more powerful than any words. No, not for your body, for your grit. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world of blinding white and crystalline silence. The land was reborn, scrubbed clean. The tension within the cabin had transformed as well, the fear replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. Silas was already outside when Alara emerged, blinking against the glare. He was clearing a path, his movements as steady and powerful as ever. They worked together without a word, shoveling the heavy snow, their breath pluming in the frigid air, falling into a natural, efficient rhythm. The shared labor was its own conversation. It was mid-afternoon when two figures appeared, dark blots on the horizon, struggling through the deep drifts. Barlow, and another man from the settlement, his face mean and pinched. Barlow's expression was one of smug triumph. He believed the blizzard had done his work for him, that he would find a desperate, broken woman ready to surrender her claim for a pittance. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Silas standing beside her, shovel in hand, an immovable object. "Well, well," Barlow sneered, his gaze flicking contemptuously between them. "Found yourself a protector, did you, Mrs. Hayes? I came to renew my generous offer. Looks like you'll be needing it more than ever." Alara felt a familiar tremor of fear, but it was different now. It was a distant echo, not the paralyzing dread that had once ruled her. She looked at Silas, who remained motionless, his eyes on Barlow, his stillness more menacing than any threat. He was her ally, her silent partner, but she knew with a sudden, clarifying certainty that this was her fight. The cabin behind her, solid and secure against the snow, was a testament to her own endurance. This land was hers, consecrated by her sweat and her sorrow. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the snow she had just shoveled. She met Barlow's gaze, her own clear and cold as the winter air. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was calm, measured, and laced with an iron she did not know she possessed. "This is my property, Mr. Barlow. You are not welcome here. Leave now." Barlow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the pristine quiet. "Or what? You and your tame animal here will stop me?" He took a step forward, but Silas shifted his weight, a subtle predatory movement that froze Barlow in his tracks. But it was Alara who held his attention. The woman who stood before him was not the fragile, haunted widow he had tried to intimidate. Her face was weathered by wind and sun, her hands were calloused, and her eyes held no trace of fear, only a fierce, unyielding resolve. He saw that she was not an obstacle to be removed, but a force to be reckoned with. The easy prize was gone. He sputtered for a moment, his bluster deflating under the weight of her newfound strength. With a final, venomous glare, he turned, muttering to his companion, and they began their long, ignominious retreat back through the snow. Alara watched them go until they were nothing more than small, insignificant specks. She did not feel triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of rightness. She turned to find Silas looking at her, his expression holding a faint, almost imperceptible warmth that reached his eyes. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of respect. It was more praise than she had ever received in her life. The world was still and vast around them, the sun casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The silence that fell was comfortable, a shared peace. "The Chinook will come soon," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, startling after so many days of quiet. "It will melt the worst of this." It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like a promise of a thaw, of a new season. She looked from his face to the horizon, to the land that had nearly broken her and had, instead, forged her anew. Daniel had been right about her grit. He just hadn't known the half of it. She was a survivor, not by anyone's grace or protection, but by the strength of her own hands and the stubborn refusal of her heart to freeze. And beside her stood a man who had not tried to save her, but had simply given her the space and the tools to save herself. A partnership had been struck, not of necessity or passion, but of something far stronger, a mutual, unspoken recognition of the resilience that thrived in the harshest of winters.